Good.
Okay, so let's continue. The number of bones in the axial skeleton are 80. The suture that is located between the frontal and two parietal bones, coronal suture. Large opening located in the inferior part of the occipital bone is your foramen magnum. The bone that is referred to as the keystone of the cranial floor is your sphenoid bone. Large projection that's found only on the femur, trochanter. Name the types of bone based on shape. You have long bone, short bone, flat bone, and irregular. Long, short, flat, and irregular. On which bone would you find the superior nuchal line? On the occipital bone. The bones that form the greater portion of the sides and roof of the cranial cavity are known as your parietal bones. The upper rim of the eye socket, supraorbital margin. Supraorbital margin. The portion of the temporal bone that is located in the posterior and inferior to the external auditory meatus is called the petrous portion. The region where the diaphysis meets the epiphysis is known as the metaphysis. Name the three ear ossicles and their corresponding shapes. So you have the malleus, which looks like a hammer. You have the incus, which looks like an anvil. And then the third is the stapes, which looks like a stirrup. Malleus, hammer, incus, anvil, stapes, stirrup. The carotid canal is located in which bone? The temporal bone. The fontanelle that is located between the angles of the two parietal and frontal bone is known as your anterior fontanelle. The glabella is located on the frontal bone. Glabella is located on the frontal bone. The hypophysis is situated in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Sella turcica. The depression on the temporal bone that articulates with the mandible is known as your mandibular fossa. The triangular bone forms the inferior and posterior part of the nasal septum. That's your vomer. On which bone is the mandibular fossa found? The temporal bone. The superior portion of the sternum is called the manubrium. Manubrium. Which bone forms the posterior portion of the hard palate? Palatine.
Is that process or bone?
No, process is in the front. It's palatine bone. Which gland sits in the sella turcica? That's your pituitary gland. That can either be called your master gland or the hypophysis. Which part of the ethmoid bone is perforated by numerous foramina that carry the olfactory nerve filaments? That's your cribriform plate. Which bone would the xiphoid process be found on? The sternum. The middle portion of the sternum is known as the body or the gladiolus. Superiorly, what does axis articulate with? C1, which is known as atlas. The olecranon process is located on the ulnar bone. The cribriform plate is located on the ethmoid bone. The medial bone of the forearm is known as the ulnar bone. The bone that comprises the lower jaw is your mandible. The olecranon fossa is located on the humerus. The depression located between the coronoid process and the condylar process of the mandible is your mandibular notch. Atlas articulates with which landmark on the occipital bone? Your occipital condyles. Occipital condyles. The depression located on the superior portion of the manubrium is called your suprasternal notch or your jugular notch. Suprasternal notch or your jugular notch. These small oblong-shaped bones are placed side by side at the middle and upper part of the face. Those are your nasal bones. The head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Glenoid fossa. Glenoid fossa. The landmark on the distal end of the humerus that articulates with the radius is known as your capitulum. The capitulum. The ensiform process is known as the xiphoid process. The study of bones, osteology. The zygomatic process projects from the inferior portion of the squama of the temporal bone. The superior nasal concha are located on the ethmoid bone. How many cranial bones are there? 8. How many carpal bones in the body? 16. 8 on each extremity. The crista galli is part of the cribriform plate. The acetabulum receives the head of the femur. The paranasal sinuses are found in which bones? Frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid, and the maxillary. The smallest of the facial bones located in the posterior and lateral, and located posterior and lateral to the nasal bones, those are your lacrimal bones. How many bones are found in an adult human skeleton? 206. Largest foramen in the body? Obturator foramen. The scientific name for the calf bone? Fibula. The joint between the two coxal bones, those are your hip bones, are known as your pubic symphysis. Pubic symphysis is the joint. The wrist bones are known as your carpal bones. The zygomatic arch is formed by the temporal process and the zygomatic process. The two round prominences located at the upper part of the forehead are known as your frontal eminences. A narrow slit between adjacent bones, fissure. A cavity in a bone or a channel for blood, sinus. This singular bone forms the forehead and is located in the anterior portion of the roof of the skull. That's your frontal bone. A prominent midline projection located on the posterior portion of the skull is your external occipital protuberance. External occipital protuberance. The oval-shaped process located along the side of the foramen magnum are known as your occipital condyles. Occipital condyles. Your middle nasal concha are associated with the ethmoid bone. Middle nasal conchas are associated with the ethmoid bone. Which bone is found superior to the coccyx bone? Sacrum. What forms the anterior 3/4 of the hard palate? Your palatine process. Which vertebrae does not contain a body or a spinous process? C1, which is atlas. The medial malleolus is found on the tibia. Medial malleolus on the tibia, so that means your lateral malleolus would be found on the fibula. The thumb is also known as the pollex. The largest and strongest tarsal bone, calcaneus. The largest portion of the hip, the ilium. A process that is shaped like a pulley or a spool of thread is known as your trochlea. This suture is located between the parietal and temporal bones, squamosal suture. The hardest part of the temporal bone is your petrous portion. What passes through the carotid canal? Your internal carotid artery. The portion of the hip bone that we sit on, ischium. Okay? Now some questions for Anatomy 3. The function of this organ is to store urine prior to maturation. It's the bladder, urinary bladder. The functional unit of the kidney is known as the nephron. The muscle associated with the urinary bladder, detrusor. This structure carries urine from the kidneys to the bladder. Those are your ureters. capillary network associated with the renal corpuscle glomerulus. The structure through which urine exits the body, urethra. The study of glands of the body, etiology. Etiology. What hormone is released in response to a raising level in circulating glucose? That's insulin. What hormones do the female gonads produce? Estrogen and progesterone. What hormone is responsible for the development and maturation of the ova and secondary sex characteristics? That's estrogen. What hormone is responsible for the development and maturation of sperm and secondary sex characteristics? That's testosterone. What hormone does the male gonad produce? Testosterone. These glands are embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. Those are your parathyroids. Two small glands that are situated on the top of the kidneys are known as your adrenal glands. What hormones do the adrenal glands secrete? Glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoid. Adrenaline. And norepinephrine. What
kind of epinephrine?
Norepinephrine, adrenaline, and glucocorticoid. What hormone increases the calcium level in blood? Parathormone. The pituitary gland is also known as the master gland or hypophysis. What hormone is responsible for the rate at which amino acids enter the cells of the body? Human growth hormone. What hormone is responsible for maintaining the body's water balance? Antidiuretic hormone. What hormones does the thyroid gland secrete? Thyroxine and calcitonin. Thyroxine and calcitonin. What hormone decreases the calcium level in the blood by inhibiting the breakdown of bone cells? Calcitonin. The overall exchange of gases between the atmosphere, blood, and cells is known as respiration. The movement of air into and out of the lungs, pulmonary ventilation. The exchange of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the pulmonary capillaries of the lungs is known as internal respiration. What is the preferred entrance for outside air to enter the respiratory system? The nose. The external openings for the nose are known as your anterior nares or your external nares. large cavity located in the internal portion of the nose, that's your nasal cavity. Vertical partition that divides the nasal cavity into two halves is known as your nasal septum. What does the nasal cavity contain that traps large airborne particles? Respiratory mucosa. The pharynx, which is known as the throat, is described as being funnel-shaped. The pharynx is the passageway for air and food. Three divisions of the pharynx: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The superior portion of the pharynx is the nasopharynx. How many openings does the nasopharynx have? 4. These connect the middle ear with the nose, your auditory tubes or your eustachian tubes. What is the middle part of the pharynx called? That's your oropharynx. The portion of the pharynx extends inferiorly from the soft palate to the hyoid bone, again, oropharynx. Name the openings that lead to the oropharynx. Those are your fauces.
How do you spell that?
F-A-U-C-E-S. What part of the pharynx is respiratory only? That's your nasopharynx. The most inferior portion of the pharynx, the laryngopharynx. This respiratory structure starts at the level of the hyoid bone and connects to the esophagus. That's known as your larynx. Your larynx is also known as your voice box. Which layer of the uterus is where the fertilized egg burrows into? That's your endometrium. The medial, short, narrow, thick portion of the uterine tube is the isthmus of the uterine tube. How many layers of the uterine wall? There are 3. This layer is important during delivery to move the child out of the uterus. This is the myometrium. What is the formation and development of the ovum called? Oogenesis. The infundibulum ends in a fringe of finger-like projections called fimbriae. The function of this structure is to transport the ova from the ovaries to the uterus. Fallopian tubes, which are also known as uterine tubes, which are also known as your oviducts. So fallopian tube, uterine tube, or oviduct, all synonymous. The dome-shaped portion superior to the uterine tube, that's your fundus. Fundus. The narrow inferior portion of the uterus that opens into the vagina, that is known as your cervix.
What was the answer before voice one?
Larynx.
Thank you.
The outer layer of the uterus is called the perimetrium. The normal site of fertilization, fallopian tubes. Which layer of the uterus is highly vascular? Endometrium. The female reproductive structure is the site of implantation of the fertilized ovum, that's your uterus. Which female reproductive structure is the site of menstruation? That's the vagina. What is considered to be the terminal portion of the birth canal? Again, vagina. What is the most highly organized system in the body? The nervous system. What does the CNS contain? The brain and the spinal cord. What does the PNS contain? Cranial and spinal nerves.
Cranial and
Spinal. What is the largest part of the brain? The cerebrum. How many lobes does the brain have? 4. Which lobe is responsible for visual information? Occipital. Which lobe is responsible for auditory information? Temporal. What's the smallest portion of the brain? The brain stem. What are the 3 portions of the brain stem? Midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. What is the most inferior part of the brain stem? That's your medulla oblongata. The smallest and uppermost part of the brain stem is the midbrain. The protective coverings of the brain is formed by tissues that are known as the meninges. The 3 meninges are, from inside out, the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. So pia, arachnoid, and dura mater. Fluid-filled air open spaces in the brain are known as your ventricles. The fluid nourishes and protects against chemical and physical injury. That's your CSF, which is known as your cerebral spinal fluid. Where's the spinal cord located? In the vertebral column. I'm sorry, the vertebral cavity. The spinal cord is shorter or longer than the vertebral column. It's shorter.
wait, what was the one before that?
Vertebral cavity. I said column. Okay, vertebral cavity. This nervous system structure extends from the foramen magnum to L2. That's your spinal cord. The tapered portion of the spinal cord, conus medullaris. Conus medullaris. The terminal end of the spinal cord, filum terminale. A tail-like collection of roots of spinal nerves located at the inferior end of the spinal cord is known as your cauda equina. The non-nervous elastic fibers, the non-nervous elastic fibrous tissue, of the spinal cord is known as the filum terminale. And last but not least, how many cervical nerves are there? There are 8 pair. Any questions? Okay.